Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and really explore how God's plan for living a holy life is beautifully laid out in the Old Testament. When we look at the book of Deuteronomy, we aren't just reading some dusty list of ancient rules. We are actually looking at a divine blueprint for human flourishing. It's a profoundly deep guide on exactly how a society can reflect the absolute holiness, justice, and grace of its creator. So today, we're going to unpack exactly what it means to be a people fully set apart.
Here is our agenda for today. We're going to be journeying chronologically through Deuteronomy chapter 14, chapter 15, chapter 16, chapter 17, chapter 18, and chapter 19. Let's kick things off with Deuteronomy chapter 14.
Now, Deuteronomy 14:2 instantly grounds us in the deep spiritual identity of God's chosen people. Think about it. Holiness here isn't just about moral perfection, right? It's fundamentally about belonging. The Israelites were specifically commanded not to adopt pagan mourning rituals like cutting themselves simply because they were a treasured possession. Their bodies, their grief, and their hope belonged entirely to Providence.
It's amazing to see how Providence weaves through our daily habits. It shows us that whether we are eating clean foods or tithing, our everyday routine actions literally must reflect our belonging to the Creator. Those dietary laws, they weren't merely about ancient health codes. They were a daily, tangible, physical reminder of spiritual separation. Furthermore, Deuteronomy 14:22 commands the tithing of the yield of the seed. But listen, this wasn't some cold, calculated transaction. It was actually designed as a joyful feast in God's presence, ensuring that the Levites, the orphans, the widows, and the sojourners were all completely fed. Holiness, as it turns out, is a daily act of joyful obedience and incredibly active compassion.
Moving right along, let's dive into Deuteronomy chapter 15.
Okay, so the Sabbath year is this absolutely profound system of debt cancellation and slave release that perfectly models God's ultimate redemption. Imagine this. Every 7 years, a massive economic reset occurs. Deuteronomy 15:1 commands the complete cancellation of debts, and verse 12 commands the release of Hebrew servants. Why? Well, because the Israelites were once slaves in Egypt, and God redeemed them. Because of that immense grace, they simply could not permanently enslave their brothers. They were commanded to release them, and get this, not empty-handed, but generously, fully supplied. So the absolutely crucial point here is that poverty is actually an opportunity to actively trust Providence by generously opening our hands to those in need, exactly as commanded in Deuteronomy 15:11. It's so incredibly easy to hold tight to our wealth, especially when you know a year of total debt cancellation is fast approaching. But God explicitly warns against that kind of hard-heartedness. The economy of God's kingdom operates on a completely different frequency. Giving generously doesn't lead to lack. It actually invites the blessing of the Creator upon literally all your work.
Next up is Deuteronomy chapter 16. This timeline beautifully traces the rhythm of grace straight through the agricultural year, moving from the redemption of Passover to the incredibly joyous harvest of tabernacles. Passover in the month of Abib anchors the entire nation in the memory of God saving them from Egypt. Then, the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost, is this grand celebration of the harvest where gratitude is shown by actively including the marginalized in the feast. And finally, the Festival of Tabernacles. This is a week of pure, unadulterated joy, dwelling in temporary shelters to physically remember God's faithful provision out in the wilderness. A really deep, spiritual truth emerges right here in Deuteronomy 16:20, revealing that true worship must inevitably lead to a life that pursues pure justice. Right after outlining these glorious times of national worship we just talked about, the text immediately pivots to appointing righteous judges. It is a stark, sobering reminder that we absolutely cannot raise our hands in joyful worship at the festival and then turn right around and take a bribe or pervert justice in the courts. In God's eyes, authentic worship and strict social justice are completely inseparable.
Turning now to Deuteronomy chapter 17.
Here we see a truly stark contrast. While worldly kings hoarded military might, which is represented here by horses, along with massive wealth and wives to secure their political alliances, God explicitly forbids all of this for Israel's king. Instead of furiously accumulating power, the king's primary duty was to handwrite a copy of the law and read it every single day, as we see in Deuteronomy 17:18 and 19. This ensured his heart wouldn't be arrogantly lifted above his brothers. Earthly power is always subordinate to the word of God.
Justice absolutely must be built on truth, requiring multiple witnesses for serious charges and demanding flawless sacrifices to honor God's absolute purity. Deuteronomy 17:1 makes it crystal clear that giving God our leftovers or our flawed animals is an abomination. He deserves our absolute best. And when dealing with high-stakes justice, especially regarding the intense spiritual treason of idolatry, God's law entirely prevents mob rule. A single accusation is never ever enough. Truth must be firmly established by 2 or 3 witnesses.
Before we transition to the next part of God's plan, we really must ask ourselves a critical question regarding spiritual guidance. In a totally noisy world that's just desperate for answers about the future, where do we actually turn? That brings us right into Deuteronomy chapter 18. While pagan nations turn to dark divination and witchcraft, Providence promises a true prophet like Moses in Deuteronomy 18:15, pointing ultimately to Christ's redemption. Think about the surrounding nations. They used mediums, omens, and even human sacrifice trying to manipulate the spiritual realm. God declares these practices an absolute abomination. His people don't need to anxiously guess or try to manipulate the future because God himself speaks to them directly through his chosen prophets, giving them clear, unfailing words of truth. We are also gently reminded here that the Levites receive no earthly wealth because their ultimate portion and provision is literally the Lord himself. While all the other tribes received plots of land, the spiritual leaders were called to a life of total dependency on God. This beautifully illustrates that the highest possible inheritance any human being can ever receive isn't property, it's not money, but a deeply intimate, dependent relationship with the Creator.
Finally, let's explore Deuteronomy chapter 19. God's unyielding grace and justice are perfectly balanced in the cities of refuge. This is a divinely ordained sanctuary, protecting the unintentional killer from the avenger of blood. Just imagine this for a second. You're out chopping wood. Suddenly, the axe head flies completely off the handle and tragically strikes your neighbor. In the ancient world, the victim's family would immediately seek a blood revenge, but God steps in. By commanding the creation of these cities of refuge in Deuteronomy 19:1-4, God completely halts the vicious cycle of blind vengeance, ensuring that a tragic accident doesn't result in the shedding of even more innocent blood.
To maintain a holy nation, truth is fiercely protected by prohibiting the moving of boundary stones and ensuring false witnesses receive the exact punishment they intended, according to Deuteronomy 19:19. Moving a boundary stone back then was basically a sneaky theft of a neighbor's very livelihood. And that infamous eye for an eye command? Actually, it wasn't an excuse for wild, unchecked revenge. It was actually a strict limitation on punishment, ensuring that the penalty perfectly matched the crime, no more and no less. It is a truly stunning display of measured, proportional justice. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to ponder today. How are you carrying this biblical blueprint of grace into your everyday life? We've seen today that God's plan for holiness isn't just confined to a temple. It invades our bank accounts, our dinner tables, our courts, and our leadership. It challenges us to trust providence rather than grasping for worldly power, and to value human life far above our own vengeance. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked the profound depths of Deuteronomy. Keep seeking the Word, keep living the truth, and I'll catch you in the next one.